Mr. President, let me begin by expressing solidarity with the people of France. As a nation, we in Kenya, who have been similarly affected, know how you feel. And let me affirm our view that to combat terrorism, which is a global problem, requires a globally concerted effort and approach by all of us. Mr. President, Kenya supports the incoming COP21 presidency's efforts to achieve a balanced, fair and rule-based agreement to guide climate action beyond 2020. As a party to the UNFCCC, we are confident that the agreement will provide the much-needed impetus to address climate change. We would also like to highlight its linkages to the Sustainable Development Goals adopted in September of this year that seek to end extreme poverty, fight inequality and injustice, and address climate change by 2030, and hence the need to synergize their implementation process. Mr. President, the post-2030 climate change agreement should, amongst other things, enhance the implementation of the Convention and include the long-term global goal of stabilizing the global temperature increase to below 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. It should also be aligned to the objective, principles and provisions of the Convention, including equity and common but differentiated responsibility, as well as respective capabilities, and also provide parity between mitigation, adaptation and provisions for enhancing means of implementation, noting the increased burden for adaptation in developing countries. It should also reaffirm the obligations of developed country parties to provide additional predictable and sustainable support in terms of finance, technology, and capacity building to meet the adaptation and mitigation needs of the developing country parties. It should ensure the continuation of the institutional arrangements and mechanisms under the Convention and subsequent COP decisions, including the financial mechanisms and the Warsaw International Mechanism for loss and damage associated with climate change impacts. In addition, the Paris Conference should enhance the global ambition to address climate change in the pre-2020 period. Mr. President, climate change continues to adversely impact Kenya's social-economic development, and my government has therefore joined the international community to pledge voluntary national measures and actions for emission reduction and enhancing adaptation to climate change. In this respect, Kenya was among the first developing countries to submit an ambitious, intended, nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC Secretariat, despite the fact that we contribute a mere 0.1% of the total global emissions. Our INDC has both adaptation and mitigation components as a signal of our country's resolve to address mitigation and adaptation on an equal footing. Kenya's INDC is anchored on our Constitution, our Vision 2030, and the National Climate Change Response Strategy and Action Plan, National Adaptation Plan, as well as our National Climate Framework Policy and Bill. Some of the sector-wide voluntary domestic measures and actions to address climate change include expansion in geothermal, solar and wind, and other renewables and clean energy. Close to two-thirds of our power generation is at present green. Progress towards achieving and maintaining a tree cover of at least 10% of our country's land area, where we currently stand at 7.2%, and low carbon and efficient transportation system. To build resilience and enhance adaptation to climate change, our National Adaptation Plan identifies at least one strategic adaptation priority action for each sector in recognition that all sectors are vulnerable to climate change. In less than 15 days, Kenya will host the World Trade Organization's 10th Ministerial Conference in Nairobi. This will be the last of the multilateral conferences in 2015 and the first ever WTO ministerial to take place in Africa. I would like to take this opportunity to call on my distinguished fellow leaders to work with your trade ministers to help ensure a successful outcome in Nairobi, which clearly demonstrates the positive role that trade can play in helping us achieve sustainable development, including through facilitating the trade of renewable energy products and other climate-friendly technologies. In conclusion, Mr. President, Kenya will continue to be guided by the UNFCCC as the primary forum for intergovernmental negotiation on climate change, and we look forward to an ambitious Paris climate change agreement in accordance with the objectives, principles, and provisions of the Convention. I thank you for your attention.